Welcome back, or if this is your first time, thank you for stepping into the dark corners of history. Tonight we won't just look at Rome, we'll peel back the folds of the white toga to reveal an empire that breathed power, blood and desire. From the explicit sex scenes carved into the walls of Pompeii, to the feasts where slaves became instruments of pleasure. From giant phalluses hung at doorways to ward off evil, to emperors who married partners of the same sex. Rome didn't just write laws, it rewrote how people made love. In this world, sex wasn't hidden behind curtains. It was etched into oil lamps, spoken aloud in poetry, and turned into a game of dominance among the elite. Are you ready? Sleeping history takes you back to a time when pleasure was ritual, excess was art, and lust was a tool for ruling an empire. To the ancient Romans, sex did not need to be hidden, nor sanctified. It wasn't sin, it wasn't love, and it certainly wasn't philosophy. In the Roman eye, sex was power, raw, measurable, and entirely exploitable. The one who penetrated held dominance. The one who was penetrated was subordinate. A Roman male citizen could have sex with anyone below him on the social ladder, prostitutes, slaves, adolescents, even other men, so long as he played the active role. This role wasn't merely about position in bed, but about status, dignity, and public respect. Roman society turned sexuality into a brutal hierarchy. At the top stood the freeborn male citizen, master of his own desires. Below him were women, tightly controlled by moral codes, reputation, and the guardianship of fathers, husbands, or sons. Then came the slaves, stripped of all bodily autonomy, unable to consent or refuse, reduced to flesh meant to serve. And at the bottom were the passive men, those who received rather than gave. Male slaves, sex workers, and so-called soft men were seen as weak, degraded, and undeserving of the Roman ideal of honourable labour. Roman morality placed no restrictions on male lust, so long as it respected the pecking order. A man could sleep with prostitutes, with slave boys, with concubines. None of it threatened his dignity. But if he seduced another man's wife, or a freeborn male, that was scandal. Sexual transgressions weren't about desire, they were about disrespecting another man's dominion. Women, however, bore the full burden of sexual virtue. A wife caught cheating could lose everything: her home, her dowry, her social standing, and even her children. Under Augustus, laws were passed turning female chastity into a matter of national duty. Meanwhile, male desire continued unchecked, released discreetly into brothels, bathhouses, and dinner parties, where no honour was at stake. In Roman eyes, marriage was duty, not passion. A wife was for bearing children, managing the household, and preserving the family name. Raw desire, panting, sweating, clawing, was relegated to places outside the sacred sphere of citizenship. It was meant to be spent in spaces and on bodies unprotected by law. Pleasure, if allowed, had to happen in a way that did not pollute honour. The man remained on top, in both status and position. Rome was not ashamed of sex. They carved it into oil lamps, painted it on brothel walls, and hung bronze phalluses from storefronts as good luck charms, but they never let it escape the architecture of power. Every touch, every moan, every act of sex followed an unwritten law that the empire knew by instinct. Desire is not a crime, but to desire wrongly is disgrace. Rome never banned sex. They only banned having it like a loser. In ancient Rome, where power was everything, and honour the most prized asset of a citizen, sex became a double-edged sword, used not only to seduce, but to destroy. The Romans didn't limit sex to pleasure or procreation. They weaponized desire, turning it into a lethal tool in the silent wars of politics and upper-class intrigue. In the arena of political rivalry, nothing dismantled a man's credibility faster than the mere suggestion he had been on the receiving end, whether in reality or through rumour alone. A single cutting remark from a rival, a biting line of verse from Juvenal, or a suggestive scene staged in a comedy, could be enough to topple the honour of a senator. For in Roman culture, sexual passivity meant submission, weakness, and a total loss of authority. Sexual accusations were wielded like legitimate political weapons. No evidence was needed, only the public imagination. The image of a powerful man, possessed, physically was enough to reduce him to ridicule. Cicero attacked his enemies by accusing them of dressing like women, serving like prostitutes. Not because it was true, but because it worked. In his satires, Juvenal painted public officials as men who read laws by day and wear veils by night to turn tricks. One of the most infamous examples was Emperor Tiberius, whom the historian Suetonius accused of maintaining an island of sexual debauchery on Capri, where young slaves were trained like pets to serve his desires. Whether fact or political fiction, the sexual imagery surrounding Tiberius served a clear purpose. It eroded his reputation more effectively than any sword. Sex was also used as a trap. A beautiful slave might be sent into a politician's household to serve him, and once intimacy was achieved, secrets could be extracted or used as leverage. In a world of spies, bribes, and intercepted letters, a night of passion could be the perfect snare. And it didn't stop there. Sex could even be used as public punishment. There are records of rebels, runaway slaves, or deserters being raped in front of crowds to send a clear message: this is the fate of the weak. To the Romans, sex was never just a personal act of pleasure. It was a dangerous political currency. Whoever held their opponent's sexual secrets held the knife to their throat. And in an empire where everyone watched each other from behind pristine white togas, it wasn't blood, but exposed desire that brought down the mighty. In mid-February, as winter slowly gave way to returning light, the Romans entered one of their wildest, most primal festivals, Lupercalia. This was no quiet or pure ritual. It was a celebration of blood, flesh, leather whips, and delighted laughter echoing through the streets, where sex, fertility, and symbolic violence danced together in frenzied unity. The festival took place at the Lupercal, a sacred cave beneath the Palatine Hill, where, according to legend, the she-wolf had nursed Romulus and Remus, founders of Rome. Here, a group of young priests known as the Luperci performed a sacrificial rite. A goat, symbol of virility and life force, was slaughtered. Its blood was smeared on the foreheads of the priests, then wiped clean with wool dipped in milk. Those anointed would often laugh during the ritual, seen as a sign of cleansing, rebirth, and restored vitality. After the sacrifice, the Luperci would tear the goat's skin into strips called februa, and either naked or wearing only loincloths, run through the streets of the Palatine. As they ran, they would lash the whip at anyone they passed, especially women. No one ran away. Roman women, including noble women, would deliberately step into the path of the whip, lifting their arms or exposing their bellies to receive its sting, not for pleasure, but out of belief. The lash was thought to enhance fertility, ease childbirth, and purge the unseen stains of the womb. Lupercalia was not merely a religious rite. It was a festival of the body where boundaries dissolved. Scholars and farmers roared with laughter. Patricians and prostitutes stood shoulder to shoulder waiting for the same whip. Sex did not take place openly, but it haunted every movement. The flick of leather on skin, the glistening bodies in the winter sun, the fleeting touch between priest and passerby. This was not an orgy, but it was a symbolic convergence of sacred sadism and reproductive yearning. The goat-skin whips became liquid phalluses, holy instruments of seed and pain, meant to provoke life through ritual punishment. Later historians like Plutarch would call Lupercalia superstition cloaked in religion. But for the Romans, it was no corruption. It was a continuation of life's eternal cycle: death, blood, cleansing, birth. Even when Rome had become a marble empire with stone temples and senators wrapped in dignified togas, the Luperci still ran through the streets, sweaty, half-naked and wielding leather whips, as a living reminder that Rome was born not from law books, but from the she-wolf's teat and animal blood. In the end, the festival persisted for centuries, until the Christian Church was forced to intervene, unable to tolerate half-naked priests running through the capital, striking young mothers on their wombs. But even when erased, Lupercalia never vanished. It lingers still as a shadow beneath our modern Valentine's Day, a holiday where love has been polished and perfumed, but no longer carries the scent of goat blood and sweat. If ancient Greece had the symposium, those candlelit drinking feasts where philosophy, poetry, and music melted into dialogue, then ancient Rome turned that idea into something far more theatrical, a living stage where sex wasn't merely tolerated, but performed, elevated, weaponized, and sometimes sacralized. In marble-paved villas draped in purple silk and rich with the scent of ripened wine, the Roman aristocracy hosted feasts that ancient historians referred to plainly as orgiae, sexual banquets. On the table, roasted game, honey, grapes, and vintage Falernian wine. Under the table, naked slaves crawling on all fours, mouths holding grapes, hands pouring wine, their oiled bodies scented not for seduction, but for easy cleaning after use. Within these spaces, all social roles were momentarily suspended. Senators and poets, noblewomen and generals, anyone could become an actor in this unscripted theatre of pleasure. The more daring, the more refined. The more unrestrained, the higher the status. This was not mere dining. It was a choreography of flesh, power, and deliberate moral transgression. And if the nobility played the roles, the emperors wrote the scripts. Ancient sources like Suetonius and Cassius Dio left behind vivid accounts of emperors who brought sex out of the bedroom and into public spectacle, especially Caligula and Elagabalus, two rulers remembered not just for their crowns, but for their theatrical excess. Caligula, the young and volatile emperor, famously transformed the imperial palace into a brothel, declared his own sister a sacred virgin, and forced nobles to copulate during banquets so he could judge their performances, like a depraved master of ceremonies. Elagabalus, a youth from Syria, ruled Rome as if it were one long fertility rite. He held sexual feasts beneath ceilings that rained down rose petals, with rotating beds, and at times live animals. He dressed as a sun goddess, married both men and women, and even staged weddings between slaves and pets, as mystical rites meant to mirror cosmic harmony. Not every Roman emperor indulged this way. But orgiae, the origin of the modern word orgy, was no myth. It's well documented in literature, mosaic art, graffiti, and even legal edicts, most of which failed miserably to contain the excess. In a society where power meant dominion over other people's bodies, sex wasn't just instinct, it was a test of boundaries. He who made the laws was also the first to break them. And when the wine was poured, the lamps dimmed, the lyres began to play amid the laughter and moans. Rome didn't just throw a party, it showcased a different kind of dominion, the ability to turn pleasure into ceremony. Because when you're an empire, even sex must be imperial in scale. Amid the white marble domes and grand temples of ancient Rome, not all prayers were whispered before statues of Jupiter or Venus. In another corner of Roman life, by the garden gate, above the hearth, at the market crossroads, gods were worshipped in their most primal fleshy form, massive erect phalluses. These were no vulgar jokes. They were divine emblems of fertility, prosperity, and powerful protection against misfortune. And no deity embodied this intersection of humour, sanctity, lust, and guardianship better than Priapus. Often depicted in Roman art with an oversized permanent erection, so immense it had to be weighed on scales. Priapus stood watch over orchards, doorways, and sometimes brothels, ready to curse any thief or evil spirit that dared to cross his path. In Pompeii, one fresco famously shows Priapus comparing the weight of his phallus to a basket of fruit. To the Romans, this wasn't obscene. It was a clear message. Size is power. The phallus protects. Wealthy Roman households sometimes built personal shrines to Priapus, offering fruit, wine, and incense, not in hopes of romantic love, but to seek practical blessings, abundant harvests, successful trade, loyal slaves, and male heirs. But Priapus was not alone. In deeper layers of Roman spiritual life we find Mutunus Tutunus, a god reduced to his essence, a stone phallus, upright and unadorned, no face, no limbs, only virility. In some traditional wedding rites, new brides were symbolically required to sit upon the image of Mutunus Tutunus before consummation, a ritual intended to awaken lawful desire and ensure fertility. This phallic reverence permeated far beyond religious ritual. Enter the fascinum, a widespread amulet shaped like a penis, believed to ward off envy, misfortune, and evil spirits. These charms were carved into oil lamps, worn as pendants, attached to wind chimes, or hung above doorways, not as erotic novelties, but as sacred talismans. In Pompeii and Herculaneum, stone phalluses still mark crossroads, pointing the way or simply blessing passers-by. Some Roman villas even placed erotic frescoes by the entrance, not to titillate, but to flaunt the virility, wealth, and life force of the homeowner. Romans didn't shy away from sex. They carved it into stone, painted it on ceilings, wore it around their necks, and worshipped it as part of life itself. In an empire where conquest was the highest virtue, the ever-erect, ever-standing phallus became a perfect symbol of dominance, survival, and Rome's unapologetically pragmatic spirituality. In ancient Rome, slaves had no bodies because they were not considered people. They bore no legal names, no right to marry, no lawful family, and certainly no right to refuse being touched. Under Roman law, a slave was res, a thing, a piece of property like a chair, an ox, or a chariot, something to be sold, leased, destroyed, or used in any way the owner desired. Sex with slaves was not considered deviant or immoral. In fact, it was a routine part of Roman society. A free Roman male could sleep with a slave, male or female, without social or legal consequence, as long as no citizen's honour was violated. Adultery with a freeborn woman? That was scandalous. But a slave? That was a private matter, not a moral one. There was no concept of consent between master and slave. The power imbalance was absolute, rendering any sexual act an imposition by definition. But in the eyes of Roman law, a slave's resistance meant nothing. Refusing, fighting back, or attempting to escape sexual submission wasn't seen as self-defense. It was seen as rebellion, punishable by whipping, torture, or even death. In the lavish villas of Rome, sexual slaves were part of the amenities. They served not only at the table but under it, in the bedroom, in the bathhouse, anywhere their owner wished. Many were carefully trained, how to walk, how to look, how to bathe, apply oils, sing, play instruments, and how to perform sexually. In Petronius' Satyricon, banquets are described where naked slaves lie motionless on silver platters, their bodies covered in food, for guests to eat directly off their flesh. Pompeii's surviving wall paintings depict bound slaves kneeling between guests, no ambiguity in their role. In Roman brothels, lupanaria, most prostitutes were slaves, owned by brothel keepers. They had no legal right to refuse any customer, regardless of injury, pregnancy, or disease. Sex for them was not a choice. It was a chore, a duty, a repetition. If a slave woman became pregnant through rape, the child was not hers. It was legally the property of her owner, a new asset added to his estate. There was no protection for maternal bonds in Roman law. Motherhood, for slaves, had no legal standing. In Roman society, where everything had its place, and every place had someone beneath it, pleasure was a one-way flow, from the powerful down to those unrecognised as human. Sex was not bound by ethics if the person violated didn't hold citizenship, and in the eyes of the empire no justification was needed when a master simply used what he legally owned. In ancient Rome, nothing was ever too much when it came to entertainment, where blood, sex and spectacle often merged into one. Yet among the many excesses of Roman public life, one subject still sparks debate among modern historians. Did acts of sexual intercourse between humans and animals actually take place on Roman stages or in the arena, or were they only symbolic, myth-inspired performances? Some ancient sources suggest the possibility. Especially in accounts from the later Roman Empire and early Christian writers, we find disturbing descriptions of public spectacles in which nude women, often slaves, were bound, paraded, and sacrificed in performances with strong mythological overtones. Familiar names resurface: Leda and the Swan, Pasiphae and the Bull, Europa and the White Bull, tales where gods took animal form and women became passive recipients of divine lust. In these staged scenes, animals, or actors playing them, took on the roles of potent bestial gods, while humans were reduced to offerings stripped of voice and agency. Writers such as Apuleius, Juvenal, and notably Augustine, in City of God, include passages denouncing these theatrical celebrations of animalistic lust, describing moments when women were dragged onto the stage for pseudo-rituals simulating intercourse with beasts. However, most of these texts are highly moralistic, emotionally charged, and lack direct physical evidence. They often emerge during the Christian shift, when Roman paganism was being reframed as corrupt and obscene. As such, it remains unclear whether these accounts reflect literal truth or rhetorical exaggeration meant to discredit a fading worldview. Rumours also surround emperors like Caligula and Elagabalus, whose names appear repeatedly in ancient scandal. Stories claim they hosted banquets, where animals were included in acts of divine copulation, blurring sacred ritual and erotic taboo. Yet, as with many such stories, the accounts appeared only after their deaths, often penned by hostile chroniclers. These sources are rich in propaganda, making historical accuracy difficult to assess. From a modern scholarly perspective, many believe the bestial themes in Roman art and literature were likely metaphorical or satirical, used to express political critique, moral decay, or the loss of human dignity in a society obsessed with dominance and display. During the late Republic and early Empire, when Roman entertainment grew increasingly violent and sexualized, these tales may have functioned more as cultural warning signs than historical fact, a reflection or exaggeration of a world spinning out of control. From an archaeological standpoint, no definitive evidence supports the claim that actual human-animal intercourse occurred in Roman arenas. However, what is documented are the venaciones, staged hunts where humans, often criminals or slaves, were pitted against wild animals, lions, bears, panthers, even goats. These were sometimes set within mythological, erotic, or fertility-inspired contexts, evoking gods like Faunus or Pan. Women were occasionally placed in these performances, naked or nearly so. Not necessarily for physical sacrifice, but as living symbols of vulnerability, arousal, and submission before an audience trained to read meaning in every movement. The intent was not always pornographic, but the voyeuristic charge was undeniable. In conclusion, while true acts of zoophilia in Roman public spectacles remain unproven, one truth is certain. The Romans were unafraid to represent, reenact, and aestheticize even the darkest dimensions of human and mythic experience. In a world where humans could be dehumanized, animals could be deified, and entertainment was built on blood, the line between performance and execution was sometimes as thin as a layer of skin. In Roman society, no one died more seductively than a gladiator, and perhaps no one ever lived more alluringly either. Men who were part slave, part myth, stepping out of the sand-covered arena with bleeding wounds, glistening sweat, and a gaze so intense it could silence an entire crowd. To Roman women, especially those of the upper classes, gladiators were not merely icons of violence. They were living embodiments of desire, raw, unrefined, dangerous. Everything their toga-clad, responsibility-laden husbands were not. In a world where marriage was tied to duty and inheritance, the gladiator became a forbidden fantasy, one both perilous and magnetic. The satirical poet Juvenal in his Satires 6 recounts the story of Epia, a senator's wife who abandoned her husband and status to run away with a gladiator, not for his looks, but because, as the text suggests, nothing was more arousing than the scent of blood, the sting of old scars, and the dust of the arena still clinging to his skin. For many women, this desire wasn't confined to imagination. It was pursued, with gold, with influence, with scandal. Historical accounts reveal Roman noblewomen sponsoring gladiators, gifting them slaves, estates, even purchasing their freedom, all for the thrill of possessing them, if only for a few private nights. It was a dangerous obsession. Such liaisons could bring ridicule, exile, or the loss of family honour. Suetonius, in the 12 Caesars, refers to Julia, daughter of Emperor Augustus, rumoured to have taken at least one gladiator as a lover. The whispers, though never proven, may have contributed to her eventual exile for a life deemed morally unfit by Roman standards. Outside of myth, the gladiator was a body honed by combat, not court politics, a man whose hands had strangled opponents at dawn, and yet could caress with equal intensity by night. He held no political power, yet he commanded a primordial magnetism that transcended social class. He wasn't a citizen, but to dream of him, to crave him, was not betrayal, because he represented what Roman women were denied: freedom. In Pompeii, across frescoes, figurines, amphorae, and graffiti, the gladiator was immortalized not only in the arena, but also in bed, in embrace, in poses far from combat, yet equally charged. In a society where power was the highest virtue, no one wielded it more viscerally than a man who could kill at sunrise and make love by nightfall. In ancient Rome, sexuality was not defined by gender, but by role. What mattered was not whether you slept with a man or a woman, but who held control, who took the active position. a Roman male citizen could engage in sexual acts with women, men, slaves, even adolescents, without damaging his honour so long as he remained dominant, the one who penetrated, never the one penetrated. Under Roman ideology, sex was an expression of power. To be sexually submissive was to lose power, and nothing was more scorned than a Roman man, especially one of high rank, accepting the passive role in same-sex relations. The Romans did not understand homosexuality as we define it today. They did not despise men for having sex with men. What they despised was a man allowing himself to be seen as feminine. In the satirical works of Juvenal and Martial, men who took the submissive role were mocked as senidi, a deeply derogatory term associated with softness, decadence, lack of control, and most importantly, feminization. This attitude wasn't confined to literature. It is etched into the graffiti of Pompeii, where depictions of male-male intercourse frequently appear, but always with an emphasis on hierarchy. The dominant figure is typically drawn larger, upright, in control, while the passive partner is smaller, bent over, or lying beneath, a visual shorthand for status and submission. Roman law did not forbid sex between men, as long as the passive partner was a slave, an actor, a prostitute, or a non-citizen. But there existed an unwritten rule, stricter in many ways than law itself. A freeborn Roman man could never take the passive role. For men of the elite, politicians, senators, military officers, being exposed as passive could destroy reputations faster and more ruthlessly than a formal accusation. In Roman society, gender could bend, but power could not. Only the penetrator was seen as a ruler, a commander. The one penetrated became a symbol of dependence, submission, and shame. Sex, in this worldview, was never just about private pleasure. It was a mirror of public power. He who controlled the body controlled the world. In the hushed, velvet-lit banquets of Rome's upper class, where wine flowed endlessly and pleasure was as expected as the next course, there often hung a small silent emblem above the room, a single rose suspended from the ceiling. There were no announcements, no instructions, but everyone present knew exactly what it meant. The rose symbolized one rule above all: absolute discretion. Sub rosa, literally under the rose, was an unspoken pact. Whatever happened beneath that flower would remain there. Whether it was a whispered political conspiracy, an illicit affair, or a private confession, all of it was to be left behind when the last cup was emptied. The rose's association with secrecy traces back to its ties with Venus, goddess of love, desire, and sensuality. But in these gatherings, the rose was no longer a symbol of passion. It became a guardian of silence, granting sanctuary to words and actions too dangerous or scandalous for the public ear. Over time, the sign of the rose moved beyond private feasts. It was carved into ceilings of secret council chambers, engraved above doors of private negotiation rooms, and even painted on brothel walls in Pompeii, next to erotic graffiti. Its message was universal. Some things are spoken only once, and never again. In fact, archaeological evidence suggests that even in the lower rungs of Roman society, among prostitutes, slaves, and performers, the meaning of sub rosa was widely understood. Silence was survival, and a single rose could draw the line between protection and punishment. Today, sub rosa lives on as a quiet phrase in politics, business, and diplomacy, a metaphor for confidentiality, invoked when discretion is not just preferred, but necessary. And though few rooms today still hang literal roses from their ceilings, the spirit of the symbol endures. Because in ancient Rome, as now, what was done was one thing, but what was remembered or revealed was everything. Nowhere does Roman society's candid view of sexuality reveal itself more clearly than in the lupanar, public brothels that were legalized, taxed, and integrated into the fabric of urban life. Sex here was not a secret behind closed doors, but a sanctioned service with rules, rates, imagery, and even visual menus. In Pompeii, the most famous surviving example is the Lupanar Grande, or Great Brothel, preserved remarkably intact under the ash of Mount Vesuvius for over 2,000 years. The building comprises 2 floors and 10 small rooms, each just large enough to hold a stone bed covered with a straw mattress. There were no doors, no privacy. Above each bed, frescoes depict various sexual positions, from the conventional to the daring, face-to-face, reverse straddling, side-lying, rear entry. These images were not merely decorative. They functioned as graphic menus, allowing clients to choose their desired act at a glance. No conversation required. The sex workers who operated legally in these brothels were called meretrices. They were taxed like craftsmen and forbidden from wearing the toga, the garment reserved for freeborn Roman women. Instead, they often wore short tunics or worked partially nude, designed for quick selection, much like dishes in a tavern. Each had a stage name: Chione, Fortunata, Felix, names hinting at style, allure, or simply provocation. Prices were posted on the walls or doorways, often just a few asses, the cost of a loaf of bread or a cup of wine. High-end sex workers, known as famosai, did not work in brothels. They operated out of private villas, often maintaining longer-term arrangements with the elite, charging fees many times higher. From a legal standpoint, brothels were not considered shameful. In fact, Roman men were encouraged to visit lupernaria as a socially acceptable and law-abiding way to satisfy urges, a preferable alternative to seducing freeborn women, which was seen as dishonourable. By law, even married men could visit brothels, as long as their partners were not married women or female citizens, and lupernaria were not tucked away in hidden alleys. On the contrary, they were often built in central parts of the city, near bathhouses, markets, forums, even temples. To the Roman mind, sex was a natural function, not shameful, and not meant to be concealed. It was etched into walls, measured in coins, and immortalized in vivid art, leaving behind a permanent map of Roman pleasure, carved in stone and fully integrated into its public and legal infrastructure. If you want to understand how the ancient Romans viewed sex, you don't have to imagine it. Just go to Pompeii. This city, buried under volcanic ash by Mount Vesuvius in AD 79, preserved a nearly complete portrait of a culture in which sexuality was not taboo, but simply part of life. From brothels to aristocratic villas, from public baths to taverns, images of sex appear everywhere. At the Lupanar, Pompeii's most famous brothel, tiny rooms barely large enough to hold a stone bed still feature frescoes above each bed, depicting a variety of sexual positions, from the conventional to the boldly acrobatic. These weren't mere decoration. They functioned as a visual menu, allowing clients to choose their experience without words, just as one might order from a list of dishes. Elsewhere, graffiti carved into the walls tells of rendezvous, boasts of conquests and casual commentary, writings that feel startlingly modern in their tone and humour. But erotic art wasn't confined to adults-only spaces. In the private homes of Pompeii's elite, dining rooms, baths, corridors, even gardens, could be adorned with mosaics or paintings depicting sensual scenes. These were often mythological in nature: Pan and the nymphs, Dionysus and the Bacchantes, or Priapus, the god of fertility, whose oversized phallus symbolized both virility and abundance. One of the most iconic images comes from the house of the Vettii, where Priapus is depicted weighing his own phallus against a sack of gold, visually affirming the Roman belief that sexual power and prosperity were intertwined. Even everyday objects were not immune. Oil lamps, drinking vessels, spoons, and kitchenware could be decorated with erotic motifs or playful sexual figures. There was no notion that sex needed to be hidden. For Romans, sex was as ordinary as eating, sleeping, or bathing, not something to be concealed from children or excluded from polite conversation. Today, many of these artifacts are housed in the secret cabinet, Gabinetto Segreto, of the Naples National Archaeological Museum. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, the collection was locked away, accessible only to gentlemen of sound morals. Women and children were strictly forbidden. Only in recent decades, as cultural views have evolved, has Pompeii's erotic art been recognised as an integral part of ancient heritage, revealing a society that did not separate sexuality from art, ritual, or daily life. The walls of Pompeii do not speak, but they recorded everything, in paint, in carvings, in stone, and in longing, so that 2,000 years later we remember, Rome was not built by war alone, it was also built by desire. In ancient Roman society, pleasure didn't require permission, and certainly didn't need a partner. In a culture where the body was displayed openly, where desire was not confined behind closed doors, seeking pleasure alone was neither taboo nor shameful. It was, in many cases, simply part of life. Among the frescoes and graffiti of Pompeii, one occasionally encounters scenes not of lovers entwined, but of solitary figures, often in poses, with expressions, or alongside objects that leave little to the imagination. In these moments, fingers, fantasy, and the occasional tool, made from wood, leather, or polished stone, stood in as temporary companions, requiring no conversation and no commitment. There were no Roman laws forbidding self-pleasure. On the contrary, it appears in visual culture, engraved into oil lamps, painted discreetly on bedroom walls, or woven into mythological allegories, where even gods were not above seeking sensual release on their own terms. Though rarely the centrepiece of art or literature, solo pleasure existed as a quiet undercurrent, ever present, yet unburdened by shame. Artifacts unearthed in Pompeii and Herculaneum, such as smooth cylindrical stones or figurines shaped like parts of the body, have led archaeologists to believe that private gratification was part of daily life, without prohibition or moral panic. To the Romans, shame did not lie in the pursuit of pleasure, but in being ruled by it. Thus, maintaining control, even in moments of indulgence, was seen not as weakness, but as a sign of strength, intellect, and autonomy. In a world where desire mapped social power, and the body was a territory of control, self-pleasure was not merely an act. It was a silent declaration: I own this body, and I know how to make it smile. Within the vast archaeological and literary remnants of ancient Rome, there is ample evidence that sex was never just about biology. It was a theatre of imagination, a mirror of social hierarchies, and, for the elite, a ritualistic performance of power. Beyond the brothels, fertility festivals, and erotic frescoes, there existed private chambers, hidden spaces in aristocratic villas known as cubicula secreta, where sexuality became a choreographed ritual. In these rooms, Rome's upper class experimented with desire not as a moral transgression, but as a carefully curated act of control, trust, and theatrical transformation. Modern scholars refer to this domain as sextus, a term retroactively applied to describe mythological role-play, power exchange, and symbolic reenactments of desire, subtly scattered across Roman texts and visual records, from satirical verses by Juvenal to suggestive Pompeian graffiti, and from mosaics in patrician homes to the writings of moralist critics. A shadow world of ritualized intimacy emerges. In one fresco, a lover appears blindfolded, wrist bound to a stone pillar, beside a laurel branch whip and a bronze mask, not tools of punishment, but props in a game of dominance, trust, and theatrical power. Elsewhere, scenes evoke Andromeda in chains, Mars demanding appeasement, or Bacchus descending in divine frenzy, inviting participants to inhabit roles they could never claim in public life. While no Latin term directly mirrors the modern concept of BDSM, the dynamics of physical dominance, submission, and role reversal were clearly practiced and even ritualized. Importantly, these acts were not always seen as hedonistic excess, but rather as a controlled inversion of Rome's rigid social order, allowing individuals to temporarily step outside their assigned identities. Emperors such as Elagabalus were notorious for hosting myth-themed banquets, where guests, slaves, and senators alike were asked to dress, act, and submit according to symbolic roles: the sacrifice, the rescuer, the fate-bound lover. These were not simply orgiastic spectacles, but carefully designed rituals of pleasure and control, where the emperor ruled not only the empire, but the very terms of intimacy. In a society where men were expected to dominate in every sphere, choosing to yield within the safety of performance became a paradoxical form of exploration. Modern historians argue that, because Roman sexuality wasn't shackled by religious taboos, it could delve further, not into moral chaos, but into sociological experimentation through the body. Ultimately, what makes the sextus rituals of ancient Rome so compelling is not their erotic nature, but their philosophical insight into power. They posed a quiet but profound question. Can pleasure be a performance? Can control be consciously surrendered? And when the mask comes off and the ribbon is untied, who truly holds the rope? In a world where gods meddled in every corner of life, from crops and war to pleasure, It's no surprise that love and sex, too, were subject to magic. When persuasion failed and hearts remained unmoved, some Romans turned to spells, thin as lead, heavy as oaths, to bind another's soul in unrelenting desire. These spells were known as defictions, binding curses. Etched onto lead tablets, they named the target, invoked the gods, often chthonic deities of the underworld, and demanded obedience, madness, or lust. The tablets were then folded, pierced with nails, and buried in graves, wells, crossroads, or thrown into rivers, places where the living met the restless dead. Why graves? Because the spirits of the unquiet dead were believed to be ideal messengers, carrying the curse into the underworld and enforcing it from beyond. Over 600 such tablets have been unearthed across the empire, from Athens and Rome to far-flung Britannia. Some of them begged for love, begged for. Others demanded obsession, impotence, suffering, or even death should the beloved touch another. The language was explicit, raw, often violent. Bind his soul, drain her desire, lock her lust. Let him go mad with longing, let her die unless she lies with me. To the Romans, love wasn't always tender. It could be a weapon, and a defixio was the dagger hidden beneath the pillow. Nobles, merchants, soldiers, and sex workers alike were both spellcasters and targets, because desire, especially when denied, cut across all classes and genders. Some believed the spell grew stronger when mixed with blood, nails, hair, or bodily fluids. Others carved small figures on the tablets, bodies pierced through the heart, or genitals with bronze pins. Rituals might call for the spellcaster to chant the name of their target 3 times, face west, and drop the tablet into a tomb, entrusting the dead to act as enforcers of erotic vengeance. Roman literature is rich with these obsessions. In Satyricon, and in the verses of Ovid and the writings of Pliny, we find echoes of lovers too desperate for advice. They sought witches instead. These were women who would call upon Hecate or Pluto, who could boil down stars and turn rejection into possession. Archaeology affirms this legacy. The defictions that survive today are whispers in lead, remnants of an age that believed love could be summoned with blood, bound by spell, and buried in the earth like a seed of obsession. Not every spell worked, but their very existence reveals something essential about Rome. In this empire, desire was never just personal. It could be manipulated, commanded, cursed, and made to rise again, not as love, but as obsession that refused to die. If ancient Greece sang of love as a soft, lyrical ballad, Rome brought poetry to bed, letting words do what hands could not. Far from being forbidden, erotic poetry, erotica, was a respected genre, studied, quoted, and performed as part of elite cultural life. Because in Roman society, sex was not hidden, and once language was used to carve out love, it never shied away from carving out lust. Ovid, court poet under Augustus, was among the first to elevate sensuality into a literary art form. In his Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, he wrote not for gods but for young men learning the arts of seduction, flirtation, and pleasure. From how to choose a lover, behave at a banquet, prolong the climax, to how to end with flair. His verses read like a Roman love manual, witty, provocative, and undeniably elegant. It was erotic without being vulgar, as if spoken by a teacher fluent in both verse and velvet sheets. But Ovid wasn't alone in making Latin blush. Catullus, writing a century earlier, had already shaken Roman letters with his fierce, explicit poems to Lesbia, his lover, or perhaps his muse, or perhaps a courtesan. He named body parts, detailed his desire, and left behind verses that medieval scribes literally skipped over when copying manuscripts, out of moral discomfort. Then came Martial, the razor-tongued satirist of the 1st century CE, who didn't tiptoe around obscenity. He dove straight in. In his epigrams, Martial wrote short, sharp poems about public sex, male passivity, prostitutes, bathhouse pleasures, anal jokes, and phallic boasts. He insulted lovers, teased clients, and eroticized Rome's underbelly. Yet instead of being silenced, he was rewarded by emperors and circulated widely among the educated elite. What's most striking? None of these poets were censored, at least not for their eroticism. Their works were copied, taught, and preserved long after their lifetimes. Even Ovid, exiled for reasons still shrouded in mystery, saw his texts survive through the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and modernity. At Pompeii, archaeologists discovered verses carved into walls, etched into stone, or painted on wine vessels. In brothels, short erotic poems hung above doorways or beside frescoes, advertising services or praising the beauty of sex workers and the skill of trained slaves. This wasn't vulgarity. It was daily language shaped into art. For the Romans, sex wasn't merely an act. It was an inspiration. And once inspired, poetry was the natural vessel. Roman verse did not fear filth, so long as it was honest. In a world that worshipped both mind and body, the union of flesh and language was inevitable, not just to arouse, but to affirm. Desire, too, belongs to the soul, and words can sweat, blush, and bite, just like a sleepless night. In the ancient Roman world, where desire was carved into stone, and power was measured in both law and bed, tales of debauched emperors are hardly rare. But what intrigues more, and perhaps disturbs more, are the stories of women who entered the arena of pleasure with the same appetite for dominance as any man. Not with sword in hand, but with a body unafraid to claim control. No figure embodies this mythos more than Valeria Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius. In the writings of Juvenal, Tacitus, and Suetonius, Messalina appears not just as an empress, but as the very incarnation of lust and political scheming. She's said to have disguised herself as a prostitute, slipping into the brothels of Rome under the name Lysiska, working the night among other sex workers, with none of the clients ever realizing who she truly was. In Satire 6, as Juvenal, dripping with venom, claims Messalina competed in a sexual contest, pitting herself against professional prostitutes to see who could satisfy the most men in a single night. And when morning came, while the others lay broken, Juvenal writes, the empress was not yet sated. A figure both titillating and terrifying to Roman society, a woman who would not submit, who refused passivity, and who dared to dominate even in bed, a position considered taboo for women of her class and status. But these tales are not only about sex, they are deeply political. Modern historians warn that such accounts were likely crafted as instruments of propaganda, woven by enemies seeking to discredit Messalina and justify her eventual execution. In a society where male dominance was the unspoken rule, powerful women were dangerous, and therefore often erotically demonized in the public imagination. Messalina was not alone. Other influential Roman women, Julia, daughter of Augustus, Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, and Poppaea Sabina, were all depicted in ancient literature as sexual sorceresses, seductresses who wielded desire not just as personal pleasure, but as a political weapon, manipulating men, unbalancing the Senate and allegedly shaking the very foundations of empire. There is little archaeological evidence to confirm these stories, and yet they have survived millennia, etched into the Western imagination, as if the idea of a woman who dares to claim sovereignty over her own body remains too potent to dismiss. In Rome, sex was never just biology. It was a battlefield of dominance, a language of hierarchy, and a metaphor for control. And sometimes, the figure that made an empire tremble was not the general with the gladius, but the woman on the stone bed, still breathing calmly after a night the historians dared not forget. Amid the marble temples and grand ceremonies of the Roman Empire, there ran an undercurrent rarely spelled out in law, yet deeply woven into the fabric of society. A superstition surrounding the human body. Not just its beauty or strength, but the invisible power believed to reside in its fluids, in semen and menstrual blood, and the dangers they were thought to carry. For Roman men, semen was not merely biological. It was power made liquid, the distilled essence of masculinity, vitality, and even political authority. Philosophers and physicians of the time, drawing on Greek sources like Galen and Hippocrates, claimed that semen was formed by slowly refining food inside the body, rising to the brain before descending again to the loins as a potent inner elixir. To release it carelessly was not just an act of pleasure, it was a loss of essence. Some ancient thinkers warned that excessive ejaculation weakened a man's body and mind, hastening aging, even shortening life itself. Self-restraint then was celebrated, not only as moral virtue but as a strategic advantage. The man who could control his seed was seen as more disciplined, more trustworthy in matters of state, and more powerful on the battlefield. By contrast, menstrual blood occupied a space of fear and taboo. Inherited from Greek medicine but adopted widely in Roman thought, it was seen as a toxic excess, a substance the female body needed to purge in order to stay balanced. To many Romans, menstruation symbolized contamination rather than vitality. Popular belief held that a menstruating woman could sour wine, wilt crops, rust metal, or spoil mirrors. The encyclopedist Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, reported in his Natural History, "A menstruating woman entering a field could kill bees, cause fruit to fall, and blight seeds in the soil." Such notions, however irrational they may sound today, seeped deeply into Roman daily life. Women were sometimes excluded from sacred rituals during their cycles, deemed unclean or spiritually hazardous. Even the mere contact or knowledge of menstrual blood was seen as threatening, capable of disrupting the energy of men performing rites or wielding public authority. In this worldview, semen was white gold, a currency of life force, while menstrual blood was the forbidden red, a sign of disorder and potential disaster. It wasn't just biology. It was a symbolic system, a gendered hierarchy of fluids, deeply tied to power, control, and societal roles. To the Romans, the body was not simply flesh and bone. It was a vessel for fate, spirit, and invisible forces. In their cultural imagination, a drop of blood or a trace of semen could mean fertility or failure, strength or decay, blessing or curse. Because in Rome, even the body was political, and every fluid told a story. In ancient Roman society, punishment was not always meted out with whips, prison, or death. Sometimes the harshest blow was the loss of honour, and in Rome, honour was written on the body. What could be more humiliating in a culture that worshipped dominance and strength than being forced into the role of the penetrated? In Rome, sex was never just about pleasure. It was a currency of power, a visible hierarchy expressed through the act itself. To have sex was to dominate. To be used, especially as a man, was to be shamed, subdued, and defeated. Thus, sexual violence was not merely an expression of lust. It became a tool of punishment, wielded to destroy dignity. Historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal recorded grim accounts of this practice, especially in the treatment of slaves, rebels, and captured enemies. In his annals, Tacitus describes male prisoners being dressed in women's clothing and publicly raped, not to violate the body but to invert its meaning. It was a ritual of a role reversal, a declaration that you are no longer a man. During periods of political chaos, such as the violent reigns of Sulla and Nero, enemies of the state were not just executed. Some were paraded and forced to play the role of the Synedi, a derogatory term for submissive men in homosexual acts, before their deaths. Their bodies became a stage where the victor proclaimed, "Behold, this is the fate of those who defy me." Juvenal in his satires often mocked the Roman fear of being sexually humiliated, a fate worse than death for the Roman male. In one famously scathing line he writes, "Better to lose your throat than your honour from behind." It may read as satire, but the fear was real and culturally entrenched. Archaeological evidence reinforces this brutal reality. Mosaics and graffiti from across the empire depict slaves bound and sexually punished, sometimes tied to statues of gods, sometimes exposed in public as living warnings. Today we would call such acts by their true names: rape, degradation, torture. But in Rome they were seen as legitimate tools of state power. The brutal truth is this: not all Roman punishments shed blood. Some shed sweat, tears, and reputation. In a society where the law belonged to the strong, the body of the weak became a canvas for a cruel message. We can do anything to you, even turn desire into justice. In ancient Roman society, sex was never merely a private act. It functioned as a social map, a coded language through which power was asserted, roles were defined, and order was maintained. Who was allowed to do what, to whom, in what position, and with which role? Each of these questions revealed the person's place within the Roman social pyramid. At the top stood the Roman male citizen, a free man with voting rights, property ownership, and crucially, the sanctioned right to conquer, both by sword and by sex. A Roman man could engage in sexual activity with virtually anyone: women, slaves, prostitutes, even adolescent boys. as long as he remained the active, penetrating partner. This wasn't merely a matter of sexual preference, it was a statement of dominance. To penetrate was to rule. Conversely, to be penetrated, whether woman, slave, or man, was to be positioned as subordinate. In Roman culture, women were assumed to be passive by nature, created to submit, reproduce, and remain within the confines of the household. A woman could be a wife, a mother, a concubine, or a prostitute, but she was never viewed as the subject of desire. She was the object, the vessel, the one acted upon. Those rare women who embraced sexual agency, such as Empress Messalina or Julia, daughter of Augustus, were not remembered as pioneers of female empowerment, but rather as symbols of moral decay. Further down the ladder were slaves, bodies without the right to refuse. To the Romans, a slave was res, a thing, not a person. Sex with slaves was not considered adultery, nor a breach of ethics, because slaves did not count as people in the moral equation. A citizen could sleep with their slaves nightly, even train them for sexual service at banquets, without a hint of scandal. Dishonour only entered the picture when the penetrated party was a free Roman citizen. This is why sex in Rome was neither equal nor private. It was a microcosm of politics played out on the human body. What happened in the bedroom may have gone unspoken, but the positions assumed, the roles performed, and the identities involved all made one's social status unmistakably clear. There was no equality in pleasure. In Rome, sexuality was a language of class. The one on top wasn't just on top in bed, he was on top of the entire social hierarchy. And the one underneath? No matter the moans or silence, he carried the mark of shame. Sex in ancient Rome wasn't only recorded in ink, it was carved in stone, painted on walls, and buried under layers of volcanic ash. What official history's left unsaid, archaeology has preserved with startling clarity, especially in Pompeii and Herculaneum, two cities frozen in time by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. There, erotic frescoes, crude graffiti, phallic statues, and the infamous lupanar brothel remain almost untouched. Paintings depicting every imaginable sexual position, role, and even species, from the everyday to the mythological, leave little doubt. For the Romans, sex was neither secret nor shameful, but simply a part of daily life. So explicit were these remains that 19th century archaeologists had to create a secret cabinet, Gabinetto Segreto, in the Naples Museum to house the most provocative finds, not because ancient Romans found them obscene, but because we did. And that is where the controversy begins. Today's world, despite its progressiveness, gender awareness, and sexual literacy, often finds itself awkward when confronted with Rome's raw physicality. Should museums display oversized phallus statues? Should children see 2,000-year-old sex murals? Were the Romans depraved, or are we simply hypocrites? For centuries, Roman sexuality was treated as the embarrassment of Western history, cut from textbooks, dodged in academia, blurred out in films. But in recent decades it has returned, not just through archaeology, but through fantasy novels, erotic fiction, BDSM subcultures, postmodern art reviving gods like Priapus, and pop culture portrayals of imperial excess from Caligula to Elagabalus. Roman sexuality is now a contested legacy, not only because of its boldness, but because it forces us to ask deeper questions. What does freedom mean? What is morality? And could what we label as perverse today once have been normal or even sacred 2,000 years ago? Rome was an empire of law, of towering architecture, of conquest and glory. But it was also a world where sex stepped beyond the bedroom, onto the rostrum, into the arena, beside the throne, and onto the altars of the gods. In ancient Rome, sex was not just pleasure, it was power, it was politics, it was art, it was social order, reenacted through the body. It was a world where honour could burn for the wrong position, where a phallus could be worn around the neck as a charm or stroked on a statue to summon a male heir, where a single rose hanging from the ceiling could turn a room into a sanctuary of secrets. And the extraordinary, perhaps even admirable thing is, they didn't hide it. The Romans didn't write the history of sex in epics. They carved it into the walls of bathhouses, painted it on wine jugs, cast it into wind chimes, whispered it in the verses of Catullus, mocked it in the satires of Juvenal, legislated it, lived it, layered through every level of society. Roman sexuality didn't lurk behind velvet curtains. It stood upright, naked and unashamed in the middle of the forum. To understand it is not to be shocked, not even to imitate, but to recognise this simple truth. Human history has never been clean. It has been both magnificent and sordid, sophisticated and savage, capable of building empires and drowning them in desire. So if you truly want to understand Rome, look where most would rather not. Because some things history doesn't write in words, it carves them in stone and blood and flesh. Clothing in ancient Rome. The clothing of ancient Rome was the product of a dynamic interplay between natural environment, social structure, and the cultural ideology of a vast and disciplined empire. First and foremost, Rome lay within the Mediterranean climate zone, marked by hot, dry summers and mild winters. This climate had a direct influence on fabric choice and garment design. The Romans favoured lightweight, breathable materials such as fine wool and linen, suitable for the often oppressive heat. Their garments tended to be simple in construction and loose-fitting, allowing for ventilation and ease of movement. Basic items like the tunic, along with outer garments such as the toga or palla, were designed with this practicality in mind. Yet climate was only one factor. Roman society was strictly hierarchical, with citizenship, social rank and family background determining how individuals were permitted or expected to dress. Freeborn male citizens had the right to wear the toga, a powerful symbol of authority and moral standing, while slaves and lower classes were limited to plain, undecorated tunics, often lacking in colour or ornament. Nobles, senators, and high-ranking officials could wear tunics or togas trimmed with purple, a costly dye associated with power and prestige. For women, the stola marked the status of a respectable married matron, while the palla, often worn over the head in public, symbolised modesty and decorum. Every garment adhered to strict social codes, functioning as a kind of visual language that expressed one's role, responsibilities, and personal dignity. Roman ideology and cultural values also deeply influenced how clothing was chosen and worn. The Romans esteemed virtue, discipline, modesty, and public order, and their clothing reflected these ideals. Modesty and restraint were prized above display. Clothing was not merely practical, but moral, a reflection of personal ethics and civic duty. The citizen's pristine white toga became a public declaration of republican ideals and integrity. The veiled palla signalled a woman's humility and virtue. In this way, clothing in ancient Rome was inseparable from the broader cultural and political fabric. It reflected the geography, reinforced the social hierarchy, and embodied the moral values of a civilization built on order, virtue, and power. The clothing worn by men in ancient Roman society offered a clear visual language of civic identity, political status, and social function. Though the designs were relatively simple, each garment carried with it specific social codes that were observed with great precision, whether in daily life, military contexts, or ceremonial occasions. The most basic and widespread item of male clothing was the tunic, tunica. This was a pullover garment, typically knee-length, with short sleeves or sleeveless, woven from wool or linen. It served as the daily attire for all social classes, from citizens to slaves. However, distinctions in fabric quality, length, and colour marked the wearer's position in society. Freeborn men often secured the tunic at the waist with a cingulum, a belt made of cloth or leather. For the elite, the tunic could be adorned with purple stripes, clavi, to signify rank. The laticlavia, featuring broad purple stripes, was reserved for senators, while the angusticlavia, with narrower stripes, marked the equestrian class. For formal occasions or public appearances, Roman male citizens donned the toga, an expansive semicircular woolen garment that could weigh up to 9 meters of fabric. The toga was not worn by everyone. It was an exclusive symbol of Roman citizenship, virtue, and civic dignity. Only free male citizens could wear the toga. Slaves, women, and foreigners were excluded. The colour of the toga also conveyed specific meaning. Toga pura, plain white, signified ordinary citizenship. Toga praetexta, white with a purple border, was worn by magistrates and aristocratic youth. Toga picta, purple often embroidered with gold, was reserved for emperors and generals during triumphs. Wearing the toga correctly required skill and poise. It was a ritual in itself, demanding discipline and a solemn bearing befitting Roman ideals. In military or practical settings where movement and efficiency were prioritized, men replaced the cumbersome toga with more functional cloaks. Chief among these was the paluda mentum, a long flowing mantle fastened over one shoulder with a fibula, brooch, traditionally worn by generals and emperors in battle or during formal appearances. Its red or purple dye signalled command and military prestige. Other cloaks served more everyday or travel-related purposes. The lacerna was a lightweight fastened cloak popular among the middle class for outings. The sagum, a shorter and coarser wool cloak, was standard military wear during campaigns, providing warmth and mobility. The penula, a hooded and voluminous outer garment, offered protection against rain and cold, comparable to a modern raincoat. In essence, while Roman men's clothing may appear restrained in style, it was highly expressive in function and meaning. From the humble tunic of the labourer to the ceremonious toga of the statesman, from the battle cloak of the general to the hooded mantle of the traveller, each piece of clothing formed part of a carefully ordered society. Roman dress was not merely practical, it was symbolic, mirroring the empire's core values of structure, discipline and social hierarchy. In ancient Rome, women's clothing served far more than a functional or aesthetic purpose. It was a visual statement of social status, marital standing, and personal virtue. Unlike men's attire, which reflected political authority and civic privilege, Roman women's garments primarily communicated their role within the household and adherence to societal ideals, especially those surrounding the virtuous wife and matron. As with men, the tunic, tunica, was the basic and most common garment for Roman women. However, female tunics were longer, often reaching the ankles or even pooling at the feet, depending on the era and setting. Women typically wore multiple layers, a lighter undertunic and a thicker, more decorative outer layer. The designs offered greater variation than male tunics, with different sleeve lengths, short, long, or winged, and were often cinched high at the waist with a belt to emphasize the feminine silhouette and ensure a smooth, graceful drape. The Roman ideal of feminine beauty, modest, composed, and symmetrical, was embodied in the quiet elegance of the tunic. For married women, the stola was not just a garment, but a social and moral emblem. Worn over the tunic, the stola was a long, pleated dress often fastened with shoulder straps or sewn sleeves to create a soft and flowing effect. Crucially, only women in legally recognised marriages were permitted to wear the stola, marking them as matronae, respectable Roman wives and the moral bedrock of the household. In this sense, the stola functioned as a silent certificate of honour and societal standing. When venturing outside the home, Roman women typically draped themselves in a palla, a long rectangular cloak wrapped around the shoulders or entire body, often drawn over the head for added modesty during public outings or religious ceremonies. Covering the head with the palla was seen as an act of decorum and humility, aligning with the Roman expectations for female propriety. Women were to dress discreetly, without excess display. The palla was both a practical outer layer for warmth and a moral symbol. Depending on wealth and class, it might be made from fine wool or linen, sometimes edged with delicate embroidery or coloured trim. What set Roman women's dress apart was its deep symbolic significance. Every layer, every style, and every gesture of wearing it conveyed a social message. An unmarried girl might wear only a simple tunic, a lawfully wedded woman wore the stola, and her use of the palla reflected her commitment to ideals of modesty and virtue. By contrast, women of questionable reputation, or those engaged in professions outside social approval, were prohibited from wearing the stola, an unspoken yet public declaration of lost status and respectability. Altogether, Roman women's clothing was a careful balance between practical function, suited to the Mediterranean climate and daily life, and moral signalling, used to define one's role, dignity, and alignment with societal values. Beneath the folds of fabric and the soft drape of the palla lay a rigid moral framework, where women were expected to embody not only domestic order, but also the honour and continuity of the Roman Republic, and later, the empire itself. In ancient Roman society, accessories and jewellery played a crucial role in completing one's appearance. while also communicating social status, personal taste, and moral conformity. From utilitarian items like belts and footwear to finely crafted gold and silver adornments, every detail contributed to a visual language in which form, function, and symbolism were inseparable. One of the most essential and widely used accessories was the cingulum, a belt worn by both men and women. For women, in particular, it served not only to secure the layers of tunics and stole, but also to shape the silhouette and add elegance through the creation of flowing pleats and graceful drapery. Cingula could be made of leather, woven fabric, or even metal, and in elite circles were often embellished with decorative elements such as metal fittings, embroidery, or gemstones, subtle indicators of wealth and refinement. Footwear was another functional yet symbolic element. Indoors, most Romans went barefoot, but stepping outside required various forms of shoes, most commonly the calci and solei. Calci were closed-toe leather shoes, often laced or strapped at the ankle, and typically worn by men of status, including senators and magistrates. These shoes could be custom-made and dyed in specific colours to denote rank. For instance, senatorial calcae were traditionally black and laced with 4 straps. In contrast, solei were open, lightweight sandals secured by leather thongs, ideal for the Mediterranean climate and worn across all social classes, including by common citizens. Jewellery held special significance, particularly for Roman women. Depending on their means and status, women adorned themselves with items made from gold, silver, pearls, and imported gemstones. Rings, annuli, functioned as both personal ornament and legal symbol. Some doubled as signet rings for sealing documents. Women also wore bracelets, necklaces, earrings, and decorative hairpins or fibulae, which helped maintain their elaborate hairstyles. Common motifs included laurel leaves, flowers, birds, and divine figures, all meticulously crafted by skilled Roman jewellers. Wearing jewellery was more than personal preference. It was a statement of virtue, dignity, and prestige in line with societal ideals of feminine propriety. One particularly symbolic accessory was the fibula, a decorative brooch or clasp used to fasten outer garments like the toga or palla. Though practical in purpose, the fibula also conveyed personal style and status. Designs range from simple bronze or iron pins to exquisitely ornamented pieces made of gold or silver, often set with gemstones or intricate reliefs. How a fibula was worn could affect the drape and movement of the garment, demonstrating one's grace, discipline, and refinement, qualities highly prized in Roman public life. In a society where appearance and ritual carried profound meaning, the fibula became more than just a fastener. It was a marker of social order and aesthetic sophistication. Ultimately, accessories and jewellery in Roman attire did far more than serve a function. They were physical extensions of Rome's cultural values, expressing hierarchy, virtue, and identity through visual and material means. From the quiet elegance of a leather belt to the opulence of a gemstone ring, each element reflected a civilization where fashion was not divorced from morality, and beauty was inseparable from order and decorum. In ancient Rome, the materials and colours of clothing were never simply a matter of comfort or climate. They were coded signals, markers of social rank, moral virtue, and even political allegiance. In a society so meticulously stratified, what one wore, and more importantly, what it was made from and dyed with, was governed by law, tradition, and unspoken cultural codes. Wool was the most common textile and the backbone of everyday Roman dress. Spun from the fleece of sheep, abundant across the Italian peninsula, wool varied in weight and texture, allowing it to serve both the working classes and the elite. Its versatility made it suitable for Rome's temperate winters, and was often woven into tunics and togas, the staples of Roman attire. For warmer climates or the scorching summers of the Mediterranean, linen was preferred. Light, breathable, and absorbent, linen was either imported or produced in Roman provinces such as Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean. It offered a practical solution for daily wear, especially for those living in the empire's hotter regions. At the pinnacle of luxury stood silk, a rare and exotic fabric imported from the east via the Silk Road. Once controversial, deemed too indulgent and un-Roman, it gradually gained favour among the aristocracy, particularly elite women. Its high cost and sheer delicacy made it a symbol of opulence, refinement, and imperial privilege. Colour, too, carried immense symbolic weight. White, especially when worn in the form of the toga virilis, the garment of a freeborn male citizen, represented purity, dignity, and moral authority. It was the official dress for formal occasions, oratory and political campaigning. The toga candida, an exceptionally whitened version of the toga, was reserved for candidates seeking public office. From this we get the modern word candidate, a linguistic legacy of Roman electoral culture. Purple, meanwhile, was the most politically charged and tightly regulated colour in the Roman world. Dyed with a rare extract from the murex sea snail, true Tyrian purple was more expensive than gold. Entire laws were enacted to restrict its use. If fully purple toga, toga picta, or garments with wide purple borders were reserved exclusively for emperors and high-ranking officials. In many periods, wearing purple without authority was illegal. It became the colour of divinity, imperial supremacy, and sacred power. Red was associated with the military sphere. Generals, officers, and soldiers often wore red tunics or cloaks, paludamentum, to signify courage, bloodshed, and martial honour. Red also helped with visibility on the battlefield and served as a visual metaphor for strength and conquest. A particularly Roman innovation in signalling rank through clothing was the use of decorative stripes called clavi. These vertical bands, woven or embroidered into tunics, indicated social hierarchy. A tunic with wide purple stripes, laticlavia, marked a senator, while one with narrower stripes, angusticlavia, denoted an equestrian. This system of visual coding made status legible at a glance, essential in the highly performative arenas of Roman politics, ceremony, and public life. Ultimately, the materials and colours of Roman clothing functioned as a textile language. They reflected more than taste. They articulated power, morality, civic identity, and belonging. To wear silk was to declare wealth. To wear white was to proclaim virtue. To wear purple, if permitted, was to stand just beneath the gods. In ancient Roman society, clothing was far more than a practical necessity or response to climate. It functioned as a highly codified system of visual symbols, capable of transmitting one's status, moral character, civic responsibility, and role within the broader structure of the Roman state and community. What one wore, how it was worn, and on what occasion were all subject to strict conventions, reflecting a civilization defined by order, hierarchy, and a deep reverence for the symbolic. Above all, dress served as a visual marker of social class and role. In everyday life, Romans could instantly identify others' status, whether citizen or slave, noble or commoner, magistrate or outsider, based solely on the cut, colour, and accessories of their attire. For instance, only freeborn Roman men with full citizenship were permitted to wear the toga, the garment most closely associated with Roman identity and civic virtue. Even among citizens, the toga's colour and style conveyed further distinctions. Plain white, toga pura, marked an ordinary citizen. A purple-bordered toga, toga praetexta, signified a magistrate. A fully purple toga, toga picta, denoted imperial authority. Foreigners, women, and slaves were forbidden from wearing the toga, making it not only a garment but a legal privilege and cultural assertion. Similarly, in women's clothing, the stola carried not just aesthetic but legal and moral weight. Only women legally married to Roman citizens were allowed to wear this garment, which symbolised modesty, honour, and domestic virtue. To don the stola was to publicly affirm one's role as a matrona, a respectable wife upholding family honour and social stability. Unmarried women, those of low social standing, including slaves, foreigners, or women engaged in disreputable professions, were barred from wearing the stola or from covering their heads with the palla, a draped cloak that conveyed modesty and decorum. In this way, Roman clothing acted as a tool of moral regulation, enforcing behavioural norms and visibly separating those within the social order from those outside it. Beyond its social function, Roman dress had a lasting influence on art, sculpture, and later European aesthetics. In Roman sculpture, particularly portraiture and divine statuary, clothing was rendered in meticulous detail. The folds of a politician's toga were sculpted with ceremonial gravity, while a woman's stola flowed in soft, elegant layers, often draped modestly over the head. These artistic choices not only demonstrated technical mastery, but also preserved the visual and moral codes of Roman society for future generations. Remarkably, from the Renaissance to the modern era, Roman clothing continued to inspire Western art, design, and fashion. Artists, sculptors, architects, and fashion designers drew upon Roman motifs, draped cloaks, structured pleats, column-like silhouettes, as a way of evoking classical ideals. Even political regalia and ceremonial garments echoed ancient Roman dress, reaffirming continuity with a civilization regarded as the foundation of a European identity. Today, the Roman aesthetic, marked by symmetry, simplicity, gravitas, and symbolism, still informs high fashion, theatrical costume, public architecture, and visual culture. In short, Roman clothing was never just about covering the body. It was a powerful medium of expression, a visual contract between the individual and the state, woven with meaning, status, and civic virtue. To wear Roman dress was to participate in a system of order and identity whose legacy, remarkably, still shapes how we see form, function, and meaning in clothing today. Clothing in ancient Roman civilization was far more than a response to material needs or climate. It was a powerful expression of social structure, moral ideology, and cultural values, woven into the very fabric of a society that once ruled most of the known ancient world. Through each fold of cloth, every chosen colour, the knot of a belt or the drape of a cloak, the Romans defined and reinforced social order, class distinctions, gender roles, and civic identity. From the toga worn by freeborn men to the stola reserved for married women, from the claver stripes on a senator's tunic to the imperial purple reserved for emperors, every garment served as a visual reflection of the political system, ethical ideals, and collective belief in a stable social hierarchy. In a civilization that valued discipline, organization, and personal dignity, clothing was not just a necessity. It was a symbolic statement of honor, responsibility, and allegiance to the state. Yet the legacy of Roman dress extends well beyond its historical context. In art, sculpture, theatre, and film, Roman garments, with their structured folds, elegant drapery, and balanced silhouettes, continue to symbolize authority, order, and classical beauty. Whether in ceremonial military attire, academic robes, or haute couture collections, elements of Roman fashion have been revived, reimagined, and reinterpreted through a classical lens. Even in modern architecture and state ceremonies, the visual grammar of Roman formality and symbolism remains vividly present. But Roman clothing was not only about style or legacy, it was a window into the logic of Roman governance and social control. Studying who could wear what, when, and in what material reveals how Rome used the visual language of clothing to maintain order, assert power, and communicate civic ideals. Garments became tools of governance, at once tangible and symbolic, individual and institutional. To understand Roman dress is to understand a foundational aspect of Roman civilization itself. It is where aesthetic form meets ideological function, where art, politics, and ethics are literally worn on the body. In Rome, beauty was not only found in sculptures or monuments, it was woven into fabric expressed through attire and used to signify one's place within the grand architecture of empire. Hairstyles in ancient Rome. Between identity, status, and aesthetics, hairstyles in ancient Roman society were not merely personal or aesthetic choices. They were shaped by a complex web of influences: natural environment, social hierarchy, cultural exchange, and the dominant ideals of Roman taste and virtue. Whether simple or elaborate, each hairstyle reflected not only individual identity, but also a Roman's position within the structured world they inhabited. First and foremost, the Mediterranean climate where the Roman Empire emerged and thrived played a crucial role in shaping hair preferences. With its hot, dry summers and mild winters, practicality and hygiene were paramount. Roman men typically kept their hair short for comfort and cleanliness, while women often styled their hair in buns or braids pinned up at the back of the head. Hairnets and modest buns served both aesthetic and practical purposes, offering neatness, cooling, and an air of decorum. Complex hairstyles were largely the privilege of the upper class, who had the leisure and servants to maintain them. Beyond climate, Rome's rigid social structure deeply influenced hairstyles. Roman society was sharply divided. Slaves, freedmen, citizens, senators, aristocrats, and the imperial family each followed unspoken codes of appearance. Slaves usually had their hair cut short or tied back for ease of work and control. Free citizens, and especially noblewomen, could wear their hair long, intricately styled and accessorized with pins, ribbons, or even wigs, signalling their wealth, status, and moral standing. Among women, the way hair was arranged often conveyed marital status. Modest, structured hairstyles marked married women, while looser, more natural styles were more common among unmarried young women. Cultural influence was another key factor. As a civilization that admired and adopted much from ancient Greece, Rome's elite hairstyles often echoed Hellenistic styles: braided crowns, elegant chignons, and softly waved locks. As the empire expanded, Roman fashion absorbed elements from across its territories. During the imperial period, noble and royal women sometimes adopted elaborate coiffures inspired by Egyptian, Eastern or Gallic traditions, curled fringes, stacked buns, and even small braids, showcasing the cosmopolitan character of Rome's ruling class and its taste for foreign refinement. Finally, gender and age shaped hair conventions as well. In the Republican era, Roman men were known for their short hair and clean-shaven faces, a look tied to ideals of discipline, civic virtue, and the austere values of the Republic. By contrast, in the imperial period, some emperors and noblemen began to grow beards or wear their hair in stylized curls, influenced by Greek philosophy and evolving standards of individuality. For women, hairstyles marked stages of life. Young girls typically wore their hair parted and braided simply, while women coming of age adopted more formal updos, reflecting their transition into adulthood and their new roles in marriage and society. Hairstyles in ancient Rome were far more than personal grooming choices. They were reflections of shifting political ideologies, moral values, and societal aesthetics across centuries. From the disciplined, modest cuts of the Roman Republic to the curled, sculpted locks of the imperial court, the way a Roman man wore his hair spoke volumes about his place in society, his philosophical leanings, and even his political ambitions. During the Republican period, 509 BCE, 27 BCE, Roman male hairstyles were shaped by ideals of simplicity, discipline, and civic virtue. Roman citizens, especially those in public life, wore their hair short, neat, and evenly trimmed, sometimes with a subtle part or a small knot at the nape, but always with an emphasis on restraint. Long or styled hair was frowned upon, seen as a sign of vanity, weakness, or excessive luxury, traits considered un-Roman and unworthy of the austere values that defined the Republic. Beards were similarly avoided. Clean-shaven faces became a hallmark of Republican masculinity, associated with self-control, respect for tradition, and moral integrity. Although some philosophers were known to wear beards, often as a nod to their Greek counterparts, the overwhelming majority of politicians and military leaders maintained a smooth, tidy appearance, aligning with the Roman belief that personal grooming should reflect civic responsibility and clarity of mind. This began to change in the imperial era, starting 27 BCE, when emperors and aristocrats began using hair as a medium for self-expression, image-making, and even propaganda. Hairstyles became more elaborate. Softly curled locks, carefully combed waves, and styled fringes became fashionable, often maintained with natural products such as beeswax or olive oil. Hair was no longer just about hygiene, it became a statement of status, personality, and influence. Some emperors used their hair to embody specific political or cultural messages. Emperor Nero, for instance, broke with Republican tradition by growing his hair longer and adopting soft curls in the Greek style, an aesthetic choice that mirrored his pro-Hellenistic leanings and flamboyant artistic persona. Emperor Hadrian, r. 117 or 138 CE, on the other hand, popularized the full beard and lightly curled hair, influenced by Greek philosophers. His portrait busts presented him not only as a powerful ruler, but also as a learned man, devoted to scholarship and the arts, a deliberate contrast to the clean-shaven, conservative image of earlier Roman leaders. Indeed, hairstyle became a form of visual rhetoric in imperial Rome. Simple, conservative haircuts were often used by leaders wishing to signal continuity with republican values. In contrast, styled, foreign-influenced hair signaled cultural openness, artistic inclination, or even political progressivism. Emperors relied on portraiture, especially marble busts where hair was rendered with striking detail, to craft and disseminate their image across the empire. These sculpted curls, parts, and beards were not mere fashion. They were instruments of identity, ideology, and statecraft. Ultimately, male hairstyles in ancient Rome served as subtle, yet powerful symbols of the era. They revealed not just personal taste, but the moral and political atmosphere of the time, and remind us today that even something as ordinary as a haircut could carry the weight of empire. In ancient Roman society, a woman's hair was far more than a matter of personal style. It was a powerful symbol of virtue, social status, and public identity. From the austere days of the Republic to the flamboyant heights of the Empire, Roman women's hairstyles evolved in step with shifting ideals of morality, beauty, and political influence. During the Republican era, 509 BCE, 27 BCE, simplicity and modesty formed the cornerstone of Roman values, and women's hairstyles reflected those ideals. Hair was typically worn long, parted in the middle, and gathered into low buns or braids at the nape of the neck. These styles were both practical for daily life and consistent with the moral image of the matrona, the ideal Roman wife, discreet, silent, and modest in dress and demeanour. Accessories were minimal. Hair was often held in place with simple fabric bands, vitae, and elaborate adornments were discouraged. Excessive attention to hairstyling was not only seen as vanity, but could even cast doubt on a woman's character. Everything changed during the imperial period, particularly under the Flavian dynasty, late 1st to early 2nd century CE, when wealth and imperial power began to reshape ideals of feminine beauty. Hairstyles became dramatically more intricate, rising higher, curling more elaborately, and even incorporating wigs and hairpieces to enhance volume and complexity. For elite Roman women, hair was now a public statement of status, refinement, and even political clout. The more elaborate the style, the more clearly it signalled access to wealth, servants, and cultural capital. Some of the most iconic hairstyles from this period include orbis comarum, a ring of tightly curled locks framing the forehead and temples, creating a halo of hair that emphasised the face. Tutulus, a tall conical bun worn by noble women and priestesses resembling a ceremonial headdress. Rolled or waved fronts. Hair at the front was shaped into high waves or tight rolls, often set with beeswax to hold their structure, and combined with intricate buns at the back. Corona, crown braid. Hair was braided and wrapped around the head like a laurel wreath, evoking both classical beauty and mythological grandeur. Unlike the Republican era, when discretion was expected, hair became something to display, especially among noble women and members of the imperial court. The complexity of one's hairstyle became a marker of rank and access. High-status women employed personal hairdressers, ornatrices, often enslaved young women trained in daily styling, curling, and ornamentation. To achieve the dramatic volume and towering shapes, women used wigs, capillamenta, made from real human hair, often sourced from enslaved girls. Decorative nets, reticula, gold or silver hairpins, jewelled headbands, pearls, and precious stones were used to further elevate their look. In this context, hair was not just a matter of fashion. It was a visual language of power and cultural sophistication. These elaborate styles weren't just for the mirror, they were immortalised in sculpture, on coins, and in official portraits. Empresses such as Domitia Longina and Plotina were famously depicted with soaring layers of curls and complex patterns, hairstyles that were as much about beauty as they were about asserting imperial prestige and feminine authority in the public eye. In ancient Roman culture, hairstyling, particularly for women, was never a matter of mere personal preference. Behind the elaborate curls and towering buns of the imperial era stood a sophisticated system of tools, materials, and techniques, revealing not just aesthetic ideals, but also the technical skill and social structure that supported them. These styles could not be achieved by hand alone. Instead, a whole array of specialised instruments and accessories emerged, turning hairstyling into a refined craft, part fashion, part ritual, and part social code. Among the most essential accessories were hairpins, or akis, long slender pins made from materials such as wood, bone, bronze, silver, or gold. Used to secure buns and coiled locks, akis were both practical and decorative. In elite circles, these pins were often finely carved or set with gemstones, bearing intricate motifs or mythological figures that reflected the taste and status of the wearer. Combs, pecten, were another indispensable tool. Roman combs were typically double-sided, with wide teeth on one end and fine teeth on the other, allowing for both detangling and precise parting. They were usually made from bone or wood, and sometimes featured delicate carvings. To hold styles in place and add symbolic meaning, Roman women also used hair ribbons, vitae, long bands of fabric, silk or wool, tied around the head or woven through the hair. Beyond their practical use in taming and shaping hairstyles, vitae held ceremonial significance. Worn in religious rituals, particularly by priestesses or brides, vitae in white or purple were seen as signs of purity and devotion. A distinctive and elegant accessory was the hairnet, or reticulum, a delicate mesh made from gold thread, silk or fine wool worn over the back of the head to contain and shape elaborate buns. Among aristocratic women, reticula were often embroidered, adorned with pearls or precious metals, and sometimes combined with diadems or jewelled pins. These refined nets became a hallmark of feminine dignity and grace, often immortalised in Roman portrait busts, frescoes and coins. When it came to styling techniques, Romans employed natural products to achieve shine, hold and definition. Beeswax was melted and lightly applied to curls to keep them structured and resistant to frizz. Olive oil, abundant in the Mediterranean, was widely used to soften and condition the hair, offering both aesthetic appeal and protection against the sun and wind. For more elaborate hairstyles, particularly among the nobility, wigs, capillamenta, became essential. Made from real human hair, often sourced from enslaved girls with strong healthy locks, these wigs were styled, braided, and added to natural hair to increase volume, height, or structural complexity. Styles like the voluminous orbis comarum, the multi-tiered tutulus, or the Flavian-era high-rolled fronts would have been nearly impossible to achieve without the support of additional hair. To curl hair, Roman hairdressers used a specialised tool called the calamistrum, a kind of curling iron consisting of two metal parts, a hollow outer tube and an inner rod heated over coals. Once hot, the rod was used to curl individual strands into waves or tight ringlets, especially around the forehead and temples. This method required great care and skill to avoid burns or damage to the hair. Professional hairdressers, usually enslaved women known as ornatrices, were highly trained and held in considerable esteem, rivaling the status of jewellers or tailors within elite households. In short, hairstyling in ancient Rome was not simply about beauty. It was a visible language of class, virtue, and social identity, supported by an entire ecosystem of craftsmanship. From the humblest wooden comb to gold-threaded nets and precision curling irons, every tool and technique carried meaning, and every hairstyle was a reflection not only of personal taste, but of the world that shaped it. In ancient Roman society, hair was far more than a matter of personal appearance or aesthetics. It was a deeply symbolic cultural element, closely tied to moral codes, social structure, religious rites, and personal identity. Through hairstyles, Romans could identify a person's social class, marital status, moral conduct, and even political stance, making hair a multifaceted expression of one's place in the Roman world. First and foremost, hair functioned as a visible marker of status and virtue, particularly for women. In Roman thought, a virtuous, modest woman was expected to wear her hair neatly arranged, usually tied into a bun at the back of the head, discreet and unpretentious. In contrast, dishevelled or loose hair in public was seen as a sign of moral disorder, disrespect toward the gods, or social deviance. Enslaved women, prostitutes, and criminals were often depicted with untamed or unkempt hair, serving as a visual metaphor for their lack of dignity and social standing. Daily hair maintenance, then, was not just about beauty, but a ritual of preserving personal and familial honour. Hair also held profound religious significance. In Roman wedding ceremonies, brides wore a distinctive ritual hairstyle known as seni-crenes. The hair was divided into 6 braids, tied together with white ribbons and covered with a saffron-coloured veil, flammeum. This hairstyle symbolised purity, submission, and readiness to assume the roles of wife and mother. Likewise, priestesses, especially the Vestal Virgins, wore hairstyles that were strictly regulated and ritualised. Their braided hair was not merely decorative, but a sacred commitment to divine service. male priests and religious officials were also subject to grooming rules, with particular expectations for hair length and styling, reflecting their moral integrity and spiritual role. Beyond its religious role, hair became a canvas for individual expression and political identity, especially during the imperial period. Women of the imperial court, such as Empresses Livia, Agrippina, and Domitia, pioneered highly elaborate hairstyles that not only reflected wealth and refinement, but also set trends across the empire. When a new imperial hairstyle was immortalized in a portrait bust or minted on coins, noble women throughout Rome would emulate it as a sign of loyalty, fashion consciousness, and social alignment with the ruling elite. In this context, hair became a subtle yet powerful tool of imperial propaganda, shaping ideals of womanhood and reinforcing the image of the Roman matrona. Men too used hair to communicate values and affiliations. A clean-shaven face with short-cropped hair evoked the traditional virtues of the Roman Republic: discipline, seriousness, and civic responsibility. Meanwhile, longer curls and beards, especially fashionable under emperors like Hadrian, suggested Greek cultural influence, philosophical inclinations, and often a more cosmopolitan or reformist attitude. Hair was not only present in everyday life, it was immortalized in Roman art, particularly in portrait sculpture and busts. Roman sculptors achieved extraordinary realism in depicting hairstyles, capturing intricate waves, braids, and curls with astonishing precision. These sculpted hairstyles served more than decorative purposes. They provide modern scholars with vital information for dating statues, identifying individuals, and interpreting social or political affiliations. Thus, hair becomes a visual archive, an artistic record of Roman values, hierarchies, and identities. The influence of Roman hairstyles did not end with antiquity. Their legacy continued to shape Western art and fashion for centuries, from the Renaissance to the Baroque period, and even in modern theatrical design and haute couture. Roman hair aesthetics, crowned buns, thick curls, and conical updos, have served as enduring sources of inspiration. These iconic styles continue to appear in historical films, classical paintings, and runway fashion, reaffirming the timeless symbolism of Roman hair. Once a personal feature, hair evolved into a lasting cultural emblem, representing order, elegance, and classical authority across eras. In the vast cultural tapestry of ancient Rome, where every aspect of life was governed by order, symbolism, and political ideals, hairstyles were far more than a mere element of personal appearance. They functioned as powerful vehicles of social expression, a visual language through which individuals communicated identity, virtue, and loyalty to the Roman order. Whether in the form of towering buns or delicately curled locks framing the forehead, Roman hairstyles served as markers of status, morality, gender, duty, and even political orientation. For Roman women, hair signified not only modesty and legitimate marriage, but also served as a subtle instrument of influence within the imperial court. The elaborate styles worn by empresses often set fashion trends that spread throughout the empire, turning coiffure into a soft yet potent expression of feminine power. For Roman men, choices around hair length, grooming, and facial hair delineated the ideological line between conservative republican values and the more cosmopolitan, often Greek-influenced aesthetics of the imperial period. Thus, hair did not merely define the individual, it reflected the broader structure of Roman society, in which every detail was meticulously considered and imbued with symbolic meaning. The influence of Roman hairstyles did not end with antiquity. On the contrary, it continues to inspire Western aesthetics and art across millennia. From Renaissance sculptures that echo the chiseled strands of Roman busts, to period costume design in historical cinema, to contemporary stage fashion and haute couture, Roman hair lives on as a symbol of elegance, discipline, and classical refinement. Crown-like buns, high rolls, and soft symmetrical curls are not merely ornamental forms. They embody ideals of timeless beauty and enduring sophistication. To study Roman hairstyles, therefore, is not merely to explore an ancient aesthetic trend. It is to open a window into the cultural depth of a great civilization, one in which every detail, from clothing to coiffure, from language to ritual, reflected a coherent system of values and identity. Through the lens of hair, we gain insight into the Romans' ability to organize society, define ethical conduct, project political authority, and craft a visual language of enduring artistic ideals. A simple strand of hair in this context becomes a thread woven deeply into the historical fabric of Western civilization.